It's time for Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast from the Spacebook for the Fandom Podcast Network. Here we monitor the matrix of all that's ever happened or ever will across the Whoniverse, on and off screen. And I'm Dan Hadley, Birmingham's King of the Geeks, designated driver of your free-speaking, big-thinking show. All those incarnations of the Time Lord over 6 decades now. Whenever, wherever and however you started your journey with whichever Doctor, you'll get something out of each and every trip with Type 40. Yes, something looks ominous against the blackest of night here. Looking for a shaft of light somewhere. Please? Anywhere. I think we can go one better than that, come to think of it. 2 positive rays of light in my friends, Charlotte and Sarah.
Hello. Wow, what an introduction that, Charlotte.
We didn't even have to pay him, Sarah.
I know.
For that.
He's going soft in his old age, that's what it is.
Oh.
Shh, don't let it get out. Don't let it get out. It's great to see you. Off we go again on another rattle around the Whoniverse here. And this time, you'll be pleased to learn that we've been extracted. We've been extracted, believe it or not, extracted through the access port of the Matrix into the extraction chamber. As this time, it's the return of a favourite strand of ours, back with a vengeance. We're accessing that file marked Type 40's frequently asked questions about time travellers. This sounds a lot scarier than it is, if you remember. So we're tasked both with plundering and grovelling around in the mind of a fellow Doctor Who fan. A nose through their shelves and to make contact with their minds. And this time it's going to be doubly delicious, as we're going to put a mate in the hot seat, whether he likes it or not. Now, you've heard him on our review of Joy to the World, that Christmas special from earlier in the year. And now we get to unlock even more pearls of wisdom and absolute undiluted joy from the mind and the mouth of Antony Wainer.
Wow, what a build-up. My goodness, thank you so much.
Never scrimp.
Never scrimp. I'm not sure how happy I feel about you rummaging around my shelves. However, I'll give it a go. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you back. Obviously, people will have heard your voice, will know your name from various Doctor Who projects over the decades, if you don't mind my saying so. Do you want to give people a little hint about where they may think, oh, it's that guy. I remember he did this or did that or did the other.
Oh my goodness, so many things that potentially I've done. When I was working for the Doctor Who Appreciation Society, I got invited to lots of different things, and particularly television studios and interviews and all kinds of manner of things. And I had a bit of a reputation at the BBC. They used to call me One Take Wainer. So they literally would put me in front of a television camera. I would do whatever they needed me to do and go home. And that got me into lots of different spaces and places that some other people may not have been lucky enough to do. So, I remember sitting on breakfast time just before Doomsday went out on that Saturday evening, and I was sat in hospitality with Heston Blumenthal and his mum. They would travel down to London for the day, and I was kind of in quite illustrious company before I went on the television. I was younger then, Dan. But I sat on the television talking about Rose and the fact that she was leaving and all those kind of things. So, yeah, it was a very fortunate, opportunity, I think, working for the Appreciation Society. I remember going to Sky News one Saturday morning when the BFI started their anniversary, 50th anniversary screen, starting with Unearthly Child. And I remember going from Bath, where I live, to London Paddington, and there was somebody stood out there on the platform with a sign with my name on it. Which was the first that that never had happened. So Doctor Who, big news. So, and I was taken to this chauffeur-driven car. The guy driving the car didn't speak to me the entire journey. I don't know if he knew who he had in the back of the car. I wasn't a celebrity. I'm not a celebrity. I'm not royalty. I'm not a politician. But he had that etiquette of not speaking to me, and then dropped me off outside Sky and opened the door, which I rolled out into Sky Television and did this interview about the magic and wonders of Doctor Who. So all kinds of stories like that, Dan.
There you go. They say that being a Doctor Who fan will never get you or take you anywhere exotic, Sarah.
And I remember the breakfast one, because I was watching anything to do with Doomsday, because that was like the start of me becoming a fan. And I remember your face now you've said it.
Yeah.
Those were the days.
They were the days. I was a little bit younger and a bit thinner. I remember I was sat sort of almost like I am now, kind of side saddle to the kind of the desk and sat there and looking very prim and proper and very precise and BBC speak. But it was happy to do. Gosh, my goodness. Got in all kinds of places.
So we're already filling in some blanks for Sarah, but the Celestial Intervention Agency, they've been on the temporal blower, Antony, and I'm afraid they're on to you, mate. But we're here to help in our time-honoured way. We're armed with Type 40's own tried and tested, frequently asked questions, and you're going to be popped into the hot seat to deliver some answers. I'm afraid that's all coming up. In the meantime, it's up to me to remind you if you'd like to do some real-time traveling of your own. Each and every edition of this show, past, present, and future, is only a tap or two away on the device of your choice if you know exactly where to look. 150 plus other podcasts, a proper back and forth catalogue of reviews, previews, interviews, geek outs, and deep dives with all our regular panelists and lots of awesome guests, something for every fan over at type40.podbean.com. More about that a little later. And of course, we'll be making time to plug our sister and brother, cousins, and other podcasts across the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network too. Yes, we're going to fill up those spaces with all the housekeeping out of the way. It's time to turn up the heat and turn back the clock with Antony Wainer and our frequently asked questions. So whenever and wherever we connect with other Doctor Who fans in our lives, in the real world or digitally, it's always the same story, isn't it? It doesn't matter whether we've met through friends or family or at conventions, maybe even at work, because Doctor Who fans are everywhere and from across all walks of life. Whatever the fan, whatever the occasion, whatever the situation, it's never too long before we all get a bit nosy and test the parameters of one another's fandoms with a combination of questions and queries that are time and space honoured. And that's where Type 40's frequently asked questions comes in. And there are a few gaps in your data extract here, Antony, and they need filling up quick, smart. We're going to do just that. Keep the Time Lord busybodies off your case. Relax. Don't get stressed. You are amongst fellow companions and fans, and there are no wrong answers. No one is on trial. First of all, I think, Antony, most obviously of all, simple question is, how old were you when you first found Doctor Who? Where was it? Or did Doctor Who find you?
Okay, this is a long story, so get comfortable, right? So my uncle and my dad were massive Doctor Who fans. So my family grew up in Bath. I grew up in Bath. They would go and watch the football on a Saturday and rush back for Doctor Who right from the early days. So, you know, I could talk about stories when I became a fan and run those stories by them, and they would be able to tell me the elements of what happened. They were very, very big Doctor Who fans. So then when my sister came along, she also was a Doctor Who fan. So then when I came along, we were hot wired to be Doctor Who fans. So there was no getting away from it. You know, my cousin had the Doctor Who annual with John Pertwee on the front from 73, with him stood rather imposingly in kind of purple velvet, stood on some rocks from Planet of the Daleks. So I was always intrigued by this imagery that was associated with Doctor Who. My first memory that I had was the regeneration from John Pertwee into Tom Baker, and it was probably the repeat showing of Planet of the Spiders. And I can distinctly remember John Pertwee laying on the floor and his face changing. And from that moment, I was hooked. And all the subsequent stories that I watched, I can remember little excerpts from. So I was 4 years old, but there was something magical about Doctor Who. There was, if you were a science fiction fan, and I don't necessarily call myself a science fiction fan, but if you were a science fiction fan, there was very little science fiction on television. I know Blake Seven comes along a bit later on, but at that time, there was very little science fiction. So if you loved science fiction, you kind of loved Doctor Who, and I certainly did. I was tape recording Doctor Who with an audio cassette, playing play and record right from 5 or 6 years old. So I had the bug, and it was catching me quite early on.
It helps, I think, when your family are sort of right behind you as well, encouraging you, feeding that, because that's not everybody's experience. Is it, Charlotte? And I was always the house geek, Well,
yeah, it's lovely that Anthony was saying basically he was surrounded by Doctor Who and it wasn't this sort of other thing. Like, I've got not as much of an expansive stuff with family, but my links with Doctor Who started with my dad. Like, he was the one who basically sort of encouraged me and said, give it a go and watch it. And he watched that first episode in 2005 with me. So I think there is something to do with this show and family. It's somehow linked intrinsically. I do believe that. Whether that's the whole family like Anthony or my situation where it was basically one family member. And it's sort of this thing of sharing. And I think that's also become a part of Doctor Who now. And that's what's lovely about it.
I had kind of similar, a set of memories from different stories, which was kind of over a period of a few decades, Sarah. It was like I was defragmenting a hard drive or something, working out which memories were attached to each story. And you do wonder, is my experience similar to everybody else's? The truth is there are probably lots of different but the same experiences, I suppose. And as the decades go on, they're going to take sort of slightly different forms, obviously, as channel TV opened up like that. But I get sort of envious when I hear people speak of stories that I wasn't around for. That's how I used to feel about it, when at a point where they're all sort of behind various archive doors rather than paywalls.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to Anthony and Charlotte's experiences, mine was very different. I came to it with the revival, so I was already in my late 19 years old. So I was already an adult, but I created my own family tradition because I'd got nephews and nieces who I got hooked on those first episodes, and it became our Saturday tradition. So I feel like I kind of passed on the torch a little bit, and when they got older, they watch it with their kids now. So it was nice to have that family feel.
Looking at the way in which your fandom was kind of hothoused as well there, Anthony, and fueled by those closest to you, do you think that sort of communal family experience could be what got you so entrenched in Doctor Who fandom as well? Another community.
Yeah, very probably. I mean, everybody was fueling the obsession. I remember there was a pantomime in Bath where John Pertwee was one of the ugly sisters. Can you believe? Not believe. But he with Melvin Hayes from 8.5 Hot Mum. And my granny took me on the Saturday matinee, and I was dressed in, you couldn't write it. And I've got a picture of this, Dan. I was dressed in a blue velvet jacket, a white shirt, a blue velvet bow tie. And my grandma took me up to John Pertwee and said, "Hello, Doctor Who." And he turned round and he said, "Madam, that was years ago." And it's actually probably only about 2 years ago since he'd left. So there was this kind of quivering me, sort of face to face with that scary man that had come down those blue credits with his arms folded, looking very austere. and grumpy, was equally grumpy outside the theatre royal door as this little boy dressed as Doctor Who was confronted, was taken to him. And I remember my gran sort of not liking Jon Pertwee for a significant amount of years afterwards because she'd been fronted by him. But I was still secretly watching Whodunit on ITV and still laughing at her. So, yeah, entrenched.
So wherever he went, whatever he was doing, whether he looked similar, was wearing similar clothes or not, even then, Doctor Who fans were sort of finding him and dragging him back in. This is probably the most frequently asked question of them all, so let's get it out of the way. Popular wisdom insists that any viewer's favourite Doctor is the first they ever saw. I've never been convinced entirely that that is true. But who is your Doctor, Anthony? Was it your first, or have you got another answer?
It was interesting because every time I went on the television representing the Doctor Who Appreciation Society, I'd always make an effort, and they never implied this to me, but I would always make an effort to say, oh, I couldn't possibly answer that. They were all amazing, weren't they? They were wonderful. They brought something different to the role. Secretly, I don't know if I probably personally felt that all of the time, but you're definitely right, Dan. My favourite Doctor was Tom Baker, and that was the first one I ever saw.
Clean and simple, straight to the point, no qualms, not ever, not in all the faces that have come since. Has he ever been seriously challenged for the top spot?
No, at the time I was it was a bit like, Tom Baker had left and Peter Davison had come along and was much younger and wasn't Tom Baker. And I think I was there was a bit of a backlash from me about the Davison years. Personally, I love them all, and I do love them all. And I would watch any one of those episodes from any one of those people and enjoy them. But at the time going out, I had a bit of Peter Davison backlash that, it wasn't Doctor Who anymore. And I suppose, I think probably Sarah and Charlotte would say the same, when their favourite Doctor left, was it as good? I don't know. You need to probably ask them that.
Did that experience there, and as you're saying, that sort of backlash against Davison, did that get the backlash thing out of your system? Because you are a really optimistic and upbeat person. And I know that you've got a variety of different tastes about all manner of eras and flavours of Doctor Who and everybody involved with this. But I always get the impression that you choose not to dwell on that. Is that something you left behind with that initial disdain for Davison? Or does it now and again, does it sort of bubble up still?
No, never. Absolutely never. Funny enough, Dan, you mentioned this. I'm watching, I promised Charlotte that I'd watch all the Matt Smith episodes in order. Oopsie. I got so far into that very first season. But I am currently watching all the Peter Davison episodes in order. And I'm currently on Snake Dance. And I absolutely bloody love them. I absolutely love them. So for all kinds of different reasons.
Tom is still the number one.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think
who's the one that's come the nearest to toppling him? Can you select one?
Well, almost we need Simon here because I think he would sort of collaborate this almost and confirm this. Okay. But I think Tom Baker is where you're coming in, and for him possibly it's Jon Pertwee, and then you work backwards. So let's go and experience. So for me, it's Tom and work backwards. So let's watch all the Jon Pertwee episodes. Let's watch all the Patrick Troughton episodes that we can, and then into William Hartnell. When I went back into, fans were devious in the 80s because, there wasn't BBC video. I had my audio cassettes where lovingly I scream at my sister during episode 3 of Keacher from the Pit because she was talking the entire time. And it was, I absolutely did my nut. So that is preserved on tape for all to hear. But you didn't have these episodes on video to be able to watch. So we were all scrabbling around for Australian pen pals to make friends with, because old Doctor Who was being transmitted in Australia in the 80s. So you would desperately make friends. It's probably, in 2025, there's probably a safeguarding implication. 11-year-old boys sending VHSs to old men in Australia, hoping that something savoury comes comes back. That was the 1980s, and that was the power of Doctor Who, because people were ritually copying these episodes across, and they were coming across back to the United Kingdom, and I was watching stories that I had never, ever seen before.
So let's flip that around then. Who's the best Doctor that you think we never had?
Gosh, that's a really good question. Blimmin' heck. Oh my goodness, who could I ever choose for the Doctor we never had? There was a story. I was really good friends with the editor of a fanzine called Scaro, which was very popular in the 1980s. It was produced by somebody called Simon Lydiard that worked and published Scaro from Bath. So I got to know him. I was quite young then, and he said, "Oh, the best Doctor we never had was David Warner, who had just been in a film called A Company of Wolves." And I didn't know who that actor was. And I remember then thinking, after he said that, as an older Doctor Who fan that had remembered some of the Troughton episodes and the John Pertwee episodes, I need to listen to that kind of older statesman fan. He's probably right. So looking at David Warner, who sadly passed away, I think a couple of years ago, I thought he would be a great Doctor. But then at that point, I suppose we were thinking about that classic series and it carrying on in the same vein. But when Doctor Who finished in 1989, when it was to come back, it was going to come back. And although the furniture would look the same and the Doctor Who kind of architecture would look the same, the kind of the Doctor, although in essence was the same, this was going to be played by a much younger man. It was going to look a little bit different.
David Warner was a popular choice. I think that's who Peter Davison always selects, which sort of closes the loop straight back to Davison there on that. I mean, this is something we hear quite a lot, isn't it, Sarah? People selecting Tom Baker, and it doesn't seem to matter whether they watched him back then or found him on satellite or cable TV 20 years later, bought the DVDs in the noughties. There's something about that man in that scarf with that hat that casts a very particular kind of magic. And whilst I find that the different ways in which people talk about him, speak about him, and the effect that he had on their childhoods, it's often the same but different. There are always little sort of wrinkles to it. It's as if he was addressing each child individually. And you can see the smile on Antony's face there.
I can, yeah, and it's lovely to see. Yeah, well, it is Father Christmas, isn't he? Of the Doctor Who. It just is. He's got that twinkle in his eye. He makes everybody feel so special. He took the time. I really struggle to think of anybody else like him. I suppose the closest I've kind of got is Johnny Depp when he does the Captain Jack Sparrow and he goes into the hospitals and things. But even so, he's still performing as a character. Tom Baker is Doctor Who. That is him. And
certain actors in certain parts, it's completely unshiftable.
I think that's what it is. It is just magical in that he is Doctor Who, and and I consider him the ultimate Doctor. Even though I came with the revival, going back, it just seems irrefutable to me.
Speaking as a big Davison fan, Charlotte, it used to get right up my nose that everybody used to harp on about Tom Baker constantly throughout the rest of the lifespan of the classic show. And sure enough, whenever we do one of these, and I think 9 out of 10 people do say Tom Baker when we put that frequently asked question to them. And at first I sort of roll my eyes, and then the subject starts talking about him, and I think, oh, Tom, it immediately that melts from me. That sort of bitterness just melts. And because even though if people give the same sort of answers, it isn't always for the same reasons. I think that's one of the good things about being a Doctor Who fan and connecting with one another.
Yeah, I think with Tom, he's in the classic when he stands out pure for one reason, because of how long he was in the role for. Like, you saw so many versions of his Doctor, in a sense. You saw that evolution. You saw him sort of go from the comedy at times to the maverick at times to the quite scary and this booming sort of individual. Like, it makes me sort of, I've been thinking recently how the modern Who sort of has got that title of the oncoming storm. and that's sort of associated with Eccleston heavily because that was a big moniker of him. I think Tom was doing that way before Eccleston, because he can just be in a scene and deliver a line in a certain way, and you feel just the hairs go up on your thing,
Yeah, and
and you can see.
he didn't need nicknames, he didn't need catchphrases, did he?
No, but it's and my first watching of Tom, 'cause like Sarah, I started with the newer stuff, so I came to classic later. But I saw him in the 50th, that scene when he's the curator. And I think I can't think of a more perfectly scripted moment that they started with just a voice. And that's what I heard of Tom. My first ever Tom was just that voice, and then you saw who it was. And just the fun and the way he was sort of winking at the camera while he was doing those lines of, well, who knows, and all of that.
Do you feel fortunate, Anthony, that you were a child during this era that still gets spoken about with such fondness, and generally speaking, that people can find very little fault with?
Oh yeah, I mean, really lucky to have grown up in what could be described for most fans as the golden age of Doctor Who, in terms of the lead actor that was playing the Doctor. But I do think the Tom Baker years as an adult, reflecting back, is broken up into sort of three parts for me. There's definitely the Hinchcliffe years, which is kind of the most serious Tom that we get in terms of his early introduction to the program, and the stories are darker, and there's all kinds of connections with Gothic horror, and it's a very darker version of the Doctor than John Pertwee had presented, particularly in that 11th year. And then you get sort of like a light-hearted Tom Baker through the Graham Williams stuff, where the production values dip a bit, and everybody's having quite a good time, and that sometimes reflects on the screen. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just think it's different to the Hinchcliffe years that have gone before. And then John Nathan Turner takes over for that final year, and Tom becomes very morose, doesn't he? And dressed in burgundy he doesn't really like, and a heavy costume that he's not enjoying, and he's been asked to wear makeup, and he's never worn makeup. So there's some changes afoot, aren't there? And I definitely see it as an adult in three chunks. Don't get me wrong, I adore and love all of the chunks. And I think Charlotte is absolutely right. For a fan of the old series watching the new series, Charlotte, for that 50th anniversary, when Matt says, I could be the curator, I could be the great curator. And in that cinema on that particular day, I don't know if you were in the cinema or watching at home, but in the cinema on that particular day, Tom's voice going, well, I really think you might. And everybody went, ooh, because they instantly knew.
It was the same where I was as well. Tom Baker has been holding audiences captive, whether it's in real life or remotely, since 1974. That can't be doubted. Tom Baker is also one of, I think, only really two Doctors to have successfully made it through an entire adventure without a companion of any kind. That's very much the exception, I think, that proves the rule that you should really have a Doctor and a companion. That brings us to the next of our frequently asked questions. I think it's far, far harder to pick a favourite companion than a Doctor. There are far, far more of them, all their own people, combinations of people too. That being said, Anthony, I'm still going to ask you anyway. Who's your favourite Doctor Who companion?
Do you know what? When the Hand of Fear was transmitted, I remember, if you asked me, Dan, what I did yesterday, I'd have no idea. If you asked me what I did at the weekend, I'd probably have to think about it a bit. If you go back to the Hand of Fear episode 4, I can see me sat on the settee back at home with a green serviette on my lap, with 2 toasted tea cakes on top of my lap, watching Sarah Jane depart from Doctor Who, and I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. This is like 5-year-old me just sobbing into tea cakes. And my sister thinking, oh my gosh, my brother, because she was 10 years old at that point, my brother is so sad. What can I do? So she wrote to Elizabeth Sladen, and a BBC signed postcard came back, and she said, well, tell your brother I haven't left television. I'm going to be doing a television program. I think it was called Windmill, of which there are some extracts on the Blu-ray DVDs. She said, I'm going to be in that and you can catch me there. And I duty bound did. But that was trauma. That was because she had been Saturday night television for a very long time. I was totally in love and in awe of Elizabeth Sladen, both as a child and as an adult, when I got to meet her in all kinds of different situations. But the very last time I saw her, she ran up to me and said, Antony, and gave me a hug. So we'd kind of made the journey from toasted tea cakes to a hug from Elizabeth Sladen. Well, actually, funny on that point, when she came back with David Tennant and she was doing School Reunion, I was there for the location for the outside of the school then. And she came out of the school, Elizabeth Sladen came out of the school, she saw me and she went, Antony. I went, oh my, it was literally like, bloody, Charlotte, I don't swear, but it was like, bloody hell. Oh my, and she went, Antony, shh, like that. And I went, because I don't think it hadn't been, I didn't know that she was in it. And it was a truly magical moment to watch her in that brown suit walk out of that school. And I thought, bloody hell, you're in this. And so my fandom was kind of full circled in that sense, from, as I say, crying in tea cakes to seeing her again in School Reunion. I got to know her quite well. Elizabeth Sladen.
I always find it interesting because classic fans, how they reacted to School Reunion, because it was such a big move and a swing to bring the companion that was like the classic companion, Sarah Jane, back. Like, how did you feel watching that?
It's two thoughts, Charlotte, really. Seeing her on the location was I was dumbstruck. But actually seeing her in the episode, I think I spent most of the time crying. I was just in floods of tears that the new series had reunited with the old, and there was some kind of bridging for because in that very first year with Eccleston, there was no real referencing to old Doctor Who, as I recall. The TARDIS was there and the bits were there, but the kind of referencing or the lore wasn't referenced as much. So I remember sobbing, and I don't know if I've watched it recently, but every time I've gone back and revisited it, I find that moment so enchanting that the new Doctor is gone back to the old. I find that incredibly enticing. And of course, K9's in it as well, but he gets slightly overshadowed by the fact that Sarah Jane is back in Doctor Who. She'd been in the Five Doctors, but it hadn't been the same kind of reaction for me at that point as it was in School Reunion, I don't think.
I have to say, Antony, that after what you said about the Tom Baker era, Tom Baker himself, I'd have been amazed if you'd have picked anybody else but Sarah Jane Smith for this. That being said, I am rather shocked at the revelation it was tea cakes rather than crumpets. What's that about?
I don't know. Not as posh family, right?
That's just weird.
Yeah, it's just weird, right? I can distinctly remember it. But interestingly, as a grown-up Doctor Who fan, if you ask me, so Sarah Jane was always the one and still is the one. But if you ask me as an adult, I quite take a shine to Romana 2, played by Lalla Ward, which is, slightly left field because there's me it should have been then Louise Jameson. But then I think as a child, I was on Backlash. So I never quite get Leela. It's like, oh, well, you've turned up, have you? It was kind of that reaction as a child, kind of like, oh, I don't like you because you're not Sarah Jane. So that I sort of spent the next couple of years in that wilderness of trying to understand, the fact that Sarah Jane had gone. And by the time Romana 2 comes along, I'm back in the game again.
It's often said that it's not the Doctors or the companions who are the stars of Doctor Who at all, of course. It's the monsters. Who was the best of the worst? Who sent you to bed chilled to the bone, whether the heating was on or not? Can you pick a favourite monster?
Oh, my goodness. Gosh. Everybody, when you talk about Doctor Who, everybody thinks about Daleks and Cybermen, don't they? And the kind of perennial baddie of Doctor Who, and now obviously they are so synonymous with the success of Doctor Who. What do I? Let's go back to what I remember from that very first couple of years of Tom Baker and the things that stick in my mind. So if you asked that kind of 1970s Anthony, I'd definitely go for things like the Zygons. Because that green and red lighting still I can conjure up in my mind's eye. I sound like Mary Whitehouse. I can conjure up in my mind's eye now. It was shockingly, scary for me, and that there's some quite scary scenes in that, aren't there? When Harry, attacks Sarah in the barn, and he's got a pitchfork, and so there's some imagery around the Zygons. I remember being particularly scared about the claw in Brain of Morbius, when the Morbius claw was kind of sort of smashing through a kind of see-through cloth. And Sarah Jane had been temporarily blinded, and she was walking towards this image that was going to sit up in the bed. The stuff of nightmares and horror. I loved it, but it was scary. And then Mr. Sin from the talons of Weng Chiang, coming out of that basket with that knife, advancing on Leela. In the house is some imagery that sticks with me. So if I think about monsters and favorite monsters, I tend to navigate to those first 3 years of Tom Baker. So I was never really an Arato fan or a Mara fan, they came a bit later on and I was less easily convinced. But by those Hinchcliffe monsters are pretty spectacular for me anyway.
Have you ever got inside any of the costumes, any of the old Doctor Who monster costumes?
I have a Famazi head, so I've stuck that on an occasion, but I have to be quite drunk to do that because it is quite fragile. Is that what you're asking me, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, of all the monsters to choose, now I did wonder if you could cosplay as one Doctor Who monster, which would it be? I mean, at least with the Famazi, there's plenty of room underneath that giant mock sail to put a packed lunch.
Yes. I need to see these photos now, Anthony. You've set this up now.
How did you come across something like a Famazi head? Because that's quite an obscure monster, some would say.
Well, back in the 80s and 90s, John Nathan Turner used to do various events at Longleat in Wiltshire, and there would be a Doctor Who prop auction and costume auction. And various bits and pieces would be sold off then. I think the first time they did that was the 83 celebration, where some really important props at that point, like the ancient worship for Law of Gallifrey from Sharda and the DMAC gun from Invasion of Time. I mean, if you had a couple of quid back in the 80s, I mean, you could buy some proper Law type props and costumes from Doctor Who. But can I tell you, I don't think I've ever told this story. I think Sarah and Charlotte will love this story. And it is absolutely true. So I was in receipt of I've sold it on now because it didn't quite work. I'll tell you why in a minute. So I was in receipt of a Vengeance from Varos Guard outfit. And I was very excited to get home after work to put on these very tight black trousers and the black boots and the red tabard and the sash and the hat. I thought, I'm going to fit into that. I'm going to give it a go. I'd never put a Doctor. I don't cosplay. I love people that cosplay. It's amazing. It's creative and all of those things. I'm not saying that it doesn't work for me. But if there's an original costume, I'm sticking it on. Anyway, my gas fire didn't work, and I'd phoned ahead to get the gas boiler person to come and service the boiler. And you're there, Charlotte, aren't you? I'd forgotten that I'd done that earlier in the day and what time he was coming. So he was frantically knocking on the door, and I couldn't get my trousers off. And I couldn't get the boots off. So I had to go to the door in the whole gap. I took the helmet off. I wasn't going to go that far. And I said, look, I'm really sorry. I'm just trying this on. Could you come and fix the gas fire? And he walked in. He looked at me like I was completely nuts. Like I was some kind of, it wasn't cosplay to him. It was just a bloke in some leather boots and a sash.
Oh, God.
dressed from Vengeance on Varos. The worst moment of my life. I was in my 30s then. I'd only just moved into this house. So it was really, Sarah, embarrassing. It was horrific. But I went with it, and he probably told everybody that this man turned up in some very kinky boots and outfit with gloves and you win some, you lose some.
Just imagine if, as he'd have been leaving your door, he'd have turned to you and said, I was more of a Sylvester McCoy fan myself, mate.
Wouldn't that have been genius? You know, I had a TARDIS in my garden, and one of the shows I did was the One Show. And the show was filmed, the first bit was filmed live, or for live, in my back garden. And various neighbours thought that, you know, I'd murdered somebody as these BBC cables were going through my house to the TARDIS.
Okay.
And I did all the, you know, the guy, I can't remember his name, he kind of does the introduction live from the One Show, and we're outside this TARDIS. Anyway, it would become a thing. You know, you'd have builders or Skype engineers or whatever come into your house to do some work. And then you'd disappear for a moment, carry on doing some work. And they'd be out in the garden posing with the TARDIS, going like this with the key, stood like this. And it's like, oh, do you want a picture with it? Oh, you could ask, do you want me to take one with you and your mate? And that would become a bit of a thing. It was you know, we were talking about the revival at that point, but it was a much loved program, and people remember Doctor Who. There's something magical about Doctor Who, I think.
So TARDISes in the garden, Beaumarcy hanging up in the wardrobe, kinky boots from Vengeance on Varos in your cupboard under the stairs, and that's just dotted around here and there. Have you got a house that's surrounded with trinkets and merchandise and bits and pieces? Because generally speaking, Doctor Who fans, we do tend to be collectors, don't we? Not many of us keep our love of Doctor Who confined to the small screen. Are you a collector?
Yeah, a big collector, but I've stopped. It's suddenly become a little bit overwhelming. I think the B&M sets, which we talked about on the live shows, you know, suddenly started to elude me, and then I started to fall off the game a little bit in the sense of trying to collect absolutely everything because I found it impossible. So I went so far into Jodie Whittaker's time as the Doctor, and then I've kind of gone adrift a bit. I mean, my love of new Doctor Who is started to wane a bit. I was very into RTD1. I'm less into RDT2. There's lots of reasons why I'm not in love with new Doctor Who anymore as much as I was. But in terms of the old stuff, the things that I've gone back and collected, which I'm very proud of, is that every one of the Target novelizations, do you remember those kind of novels of the stories that as they were transmitted became a bit of those ones became a little bit of a Bible for me, because I was cross-referencing those books and what I was reading in those books against the audio recordings that I had made. So these books became a little bit of the embellishment of the things I couldn't see, I could only hear. So I went back and collected all of those books in hardback, the library versions, and I've got every single one in hardback. So if
that's like going for the marathon rather than the half marathon, isn't it?
Yeah, I love those books so much. So I've made the effort, and they were readily available when I started collecting them in the 90s. I think they're less so now, which is unfortunate for anybody that wanted to get into collecting them. There's some notoriously difficult ones to find. Those
Target books are the spine, the backbone to a great many collections. Even now, new people tend to sort of go for them before everything else, really, as if there's something emblematic about them, iconic about them in themselves. Sarah and Charlotte, you're both big readers. I'm not really. I was when I was a kid. I'm not now. You're both big readers. We hear this quite a lot, don't we? People talk about the Target books and get all misty-eyed.
Yeah, and it's I understand why. You know, it's a lifeline for a lot of fans, especially if you went around for the stories. You know, like the Hartnell, the Troughtons. It was the only way you could find out about them. What was this story? Yeah, I can totally see why they're popular. I mean, they look gorgeous. I mean, you could just have them on your shelf presented like that, and just as works of art, they're just stunning. I've got a few myself. Every so often, like if I'm in a charity shop or something, and I'll see them, I'm like, well, I've got to get them, you know. While they're there, it'd be rude not to, wouldn't it?
Sarah, they insist, don't they, that as regards sort of things to have in one's home, that the laws of feng shui and the phrase that less is more. I don't think Doctor Who fans, that the phrase less is more is never going to wash with Doctor Who fans. We've got to try and find extra shelf space somewhere.
Yeah, you do. I mean, I get what Anthony's saying. There comes a point where you just haven't got room. You know, I mean, I've got 2 kids, so I'm full of their stuff as well. So it is getting a bit ridiculous, you know, that I've got all these figures. And one thing I got recently was, I don't know if you remember, I think it was during the Tennant era, they brought out Dalek Operation, you know, the game.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it was a Dalek. And I found it in a charity shop for 50p, and I was like, I'm having that. That's an absolute bargain. And it still works. And honestly, I wish I could have recorded it for you, for the show. Put the batteries in, and it still worked. I was so happy to hear this start operating on this Dalek. And it's on my shelf. And I know really I should put it away, but it just looks so cool. And I love that orange logo anyway. But I think that might be my limit now. You know, I've got the board game. That's all I need.
You've got like the apex thing of the board game, so now you're happy.
Yeah, I mean, how do you beat that? I mean, apart from those pants,
Yeah.
I don't know. You know what else I could do.
Do you share the fascination so many of us have, Anthony, with other people's collections? You know, you've decided on the confines of your own collection. Do you still find it interesting when people say, well, actually, I collect all the Doctor Who First Day covers, for example, or I only go for screen used or production used scripts, you know, things that aren't even conventionally, commercially available? Because I always say there's nothing better than looking at a bit of shelf porn. We love to see inside people's homes, and as fans of any kind of IP or genre, even broader genre, there's nothing better than saying, oh, well, I've got that. I wonder if they've got that. Do you share that kind of instinct?
Yeah, I do. And what's really interesting from the time that I grew up watching Doctor Who, so by the time that I was 15 and 16 and spending my own money and earning my own money and stuff, the merchandise from the 60s was still readily available. So like Sarah is saying about the Dalek operation, you could walk into a shop or a secondhand charity shop and find Doctor Who books from the 60s or games from the 60s. They were being thrown out at that point. So I think it was quite fortunate to, go to a car boot sale. It probably wasn't a car boot sale in the 80s, a jumble sale, and then finding the second Patrick Troughton annual for 5p and thinking that you'd struck a gold mine of stuff. And you would and it was quite excited then to go back and revisit some things you didn't have. In terms of the question about you asking me about, whatever collectors had, I think there was a book called The 60s, and then later the 70s by David Howe and Mark Stammers, which was the kind of first time where there was a merchandise book. I know there'd been a Doctor Who magazine merchandise special in the mid-80s where there were various photographs of old merchandise, but there were those 60s and 70s books which were beautifully photographed old merchandise, and I was sat in looking through that book marveling at some stuff that I'd never seen before, which David Howland particularly has a extensive collection of Doctor Who memorabilia, but these were the photographs of his stuff, and it was kind of the first time when you could think, this was before eBay. This was before you could just go online and find an overpriced Doctor Who item. You would want to go and treasure hunt it. And that was something quite exciting when you were in, I wasn't your normal 20-year-old, was I? 20-year-old in 2025 standards is, potentially going out and meeting your friends. And meanwhile, I was wandering around charity shops looking for the Doctor Who omnibus from 1965. My family, who had given me this bug of Doctor Who kind of interest, was then fueling me to go around charity shops and jumble sales of
Anthony, I was a bargain hunter then with my little scribbled down list, and I am now. Are you a bargain hunter, Charlotte? Do you go around the Chazza shops and frequent a car boot?
Growing up, I did a lot of car boots with family because we would either use it just to sell if we had stuff, or just have a mooch, as we would call it, have a look around.
Mooch.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm one of these that if I see something that's sort of like, I go, oh, that's fun, and if it's not ridiculous, I will happily buy it. I've always been like that. But I think
pops up.
Yeah, I felt like whenever they can, the BBC, at its best, I'll put it, has actually been quite clever with how they've expanded Doctor Who.
Well, there's also that peculiar thing as well, isn't there, Anthony, whereby even if you've got no intention of reading a particular book, and I'm so guilty of this, I've got books in my collection I've never even opened, never mind read, simply because I had to have them all. I've got no interest in actually reading it, but I thought I can't have that gap. Are you like that as well?
Yeah, I was initially. There were very few factual Doctor Who books around in the 80s. I think we talked about this before, the Peter Haining books, to celebrate 20 years of Doctor Who, and then again 25 years of Doctor Who, and I think there was The Key to Time in between. Those were kind of the first kind of factual books about Doctor Who. I know there had been The Making of Doctor Who with John Pertwee on the front, that was then revisited with Tom Baker on the front. In terms of factual books about Doctor Who, they weren't in existence. So at that time, I would be buying absolutely everything. I think we talked about The Early Years by Jeremy Bentham as being one of those kind of standout pieces where he was delving back into black and white photographs of the 60s Doctor Who, and there were some pictures and imagery that I'd never seen before. So it was quite an exciting time to be a Doctor Who fan. In equal handfuls, a kind of disappointing time to be a Doctor Who fan, because as fandom created its own lists and memories about Doctor Who, there was suddenly this growing realization that some episodes of Doctor Who, courtesy of the Doctor Who summer special, when they delved back into the archives, there was a realization that not all old Doctor Who existed. So I wasn't old enough to be pioneering in that sense. So people like Ian Levine would have been those people that would have been pioneering in terms of working out how or what the archives had, the BBC archives had, in terms of their archive holdings for Doctor Who. And
we knew so little.
Yes. I mean, it was not a pretty, when they produced that list and, the colour Pertwees didn't exist and a significant number of Hartnell and Troughton episodes didn't exist, you were like, oh, blimmin' X. So here were the books that we were able to revisit the stories. Sarah is absolutely right. They were the lifeline to old Doctor Who. And you were hoping you were going to be able to one day see that old Doctor Who, but that realization was that they didn't exist was pretty awful in the 80s. I remember that particularly.
You've just pinpointed something that I've not really thought of before. And there was a time where Doctor Who, you'd got the annuals, you got the hardback gift books, omnibus editions, collected target books into larger format books, and luxury items like the St. Michael's Doctor Who, fully illustrated, outsized hardback, but they were all based around the fiction. There seemed to come a point in the early to mid-80s where all of a sudden Doctor Who became something that could support the publishing of next to academic style textbooks. Yeah. So there was Doctor Who, the unfolding text, might have been the first one out. And then there was The Early Years, the one that you're talking about. And then things got deeper. It seemed to happen really, really slowly. And I've not thought about it until you just sort of mentioned 2 or 3, and they were all out within a certain period of one another. But I think it had been on for so long and people had grown up with it. People who'd wanted to be writers, they'd got to positions where they would be writers and made connections, and maybe some agent or publisher would ask them, okay, so you are a writer now, what would you like to write about? Oh, Doctor Who, which is kind of how a lot of us were at school, you know, like in creative writing class or something. I certainly wrote 2 or 3 Doctor Who stories for some school project or another. And I think that a lot of people probably started out that way and then found a way to explore Doctor Who sort of professionally. And those books must have been part of that, because up until then, I think entertainment wise, it has sort of been concentrated on not just film, but a particular era of film, like the golden era of Hollywood, and that was sort of where those kind of studies had sort of started and ended. And I think Doctor Who pioneered quite a lot of that. Speaking of movies and TV, it's one thing to fill your house with various Doctor Who bits and pieces and merchandise, and you can watch it on a loop now if you wish. How lucky they are now with streaming platforms and Blu-rays and DVDs. There's an abundance of Doctor Who on the screen. But back then, of course, Doctor Who would be off for months on end, and unless you'd got stocked up on BASF or Scotch videotapes, odds are that past stories were fading memories. So I had to sort of get my geeky fix elsewhere, latch onto other things. I often felt like I was turning traitor on Doctor Who. Which other characters or franchises or TV shows were you a big fan of then and now? And is it exclusively in sort of sci-fi and fantasy, or is Doctor Who actually the outlier and you don't watch any other geeky content at all? Are you more at home with Emmerdale and Call the Midwife usually?
I don't actually consider myself to be a science fiction fan. So every kind of television program I've ever been on, I always kind of said, well, Doctor Who was never really science fiction, was it? But then it always was. So it could do different things in different weeks. It could look different. It could be different. You know, every episode was different. And I kind of liked that. It was a bit like the Irwin Allen drama, The Time Tunnel, which was, you know, a group of people being sucked down a time tunnel and they would come and appear in different places. Yeah. And I think that kind of idea of C.S. Lewis and the wardrobe and walking through a wardrobe and going somewhere different was kind of quite exciting. And it was kind of that had some intrigue for me. So Doctor Who was always the thing, but there was a couple of other things along the way. So Blake 7, I enjoyed, but I was never. I don't know whether I was just the wrong age for it, but it was never something that truly captivated me. I've watched, you know, the first series as it's been released on Blu-ray, but it never truly captured my imagination like Doctor Who had done. I really enjoyed Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when that was dramatized for the BBC. I really loved that because I really liked the music, and that was a bit like event TV because my dad had read the book. And that was something we sat down and did as me and him. So that was pretty eventful television. And I kind of like this ITV drama called Into the Labyrinth, which again was kind of this, I think it had Pamela Salam in it from Robots of Death.
Yeah,
but
I remember that.
Yeah, it was kind of, again, it was like a kid show, but it was kind of, they would go to different places every week. It would be different scenarios every week. So that idea of time traveling and kind of scenario jumping was kind of intriguing to me. You know, whenever I had an opportunity for, you know, I had the Palatoy TARDIS. Do you remember the one that you had the light and you could press the buttons and you could spin the Doctor around inside?
I've seen pictures, I've seen the commercials, and I've never seen one in the wild.
Well, I have one. I haven't played with it for a while, Dan, but I would have that TARDIS, you know, the TARDIS model and the box. It's still here. It still exists. But I would get a shoebox and cut a slit up through the middle and stick windows on it. And that shoebox would be the TARDIS because the Palatoy one didn't kind of look right. I wanted to create my own. So I was always into that kind of mystery about the TARDIS and how it moved, took you from other places and other times. So I wasn't, you know, I was a big Star Wars fan because that was big science fiction on a big, you know, big screen. and I started collecting the figures for Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. But by the time Jedi came along, I was a little bit older, didn't have the figures. So I liked Star Wars, but never in as much as I liked Doctor Who. I was bitten by a bug really early on, and like lots of people listening to this, and like Sarah and Charlotte and yourself, Dan, it's caught me and it's kind of stayed with me. And some days I wish I could get rid of it, just for a minute and not. But then there will be something that I'll be somewhere and I'll see something and it'll trigger a memory or a thought about Doctor Who. So I keep coming back to Doctor Who.
We talk about this now and again too, don't we? About what is Doctor Who, which bracket does it fall into? I think it probably is in a class all of its own to some degree or another. But to hear you talk, the things that you're pointing to, Blake Seven, Time Tunnel, Into the Labyrinth, they're all very different shows, and yet there's a kind of Venn diagram you could probably draw out, and Doctor Who would maybe be in the middle of them. So it's as if when it wasn't around, you were also trying to, okay, what's a little bit like Doctor Who? What, and like you said about Elizabeth Sladen earlier on, she let you know which other show she was going to be in. I used to do that as well, follow the actors around. Or even sometimes if I knew a name from the credits, I'd go and see, oh, it's them. I wonder what they're doing now. And I would say, and usually it wouldn't be anything I was remotely interested in because obviously they were professionals. They were trying to do a broad variety of things. But with actors, I'd certainly watch anything that Peter Davison was in just because he'd been Doctor Who. And there were several other people that it was like that. But with me, it was always anything that was geeky. I was reading comics. I was watching the movies. I was, it's all sci-fi, fantasy, all that kind of thing. But I often say to people, I do think that it does, the notion of time travel in particular, and the do-over, I suppose. I think that's what a lot of people find seductive about the notion of time travel. And I think what made the series stand out for me in the late 70s, because it's not unheard of, is it, Charlotte? We do hear this now and again where people say, well, I'm not really usually a geek. I know people who used to, when Matt Smith was the Doctor, and they would say to me, friends of friends would say, oh, you like Doctor Who? Yeah, I watch that every week. It's my little bit of geekiness on a Saturday. And that was, everything else they watched was like Hollyoaks and all that sort of stuff.
Well, here's the thing. I'm also one of these that I love Doctor Who, but I'm not a hard sci-fi person like Anthony. Like, I've tried Star Trek, and I think that because that, for example, is a lot more hard sci-fi, I would class that as, and it's a lot more in the forefront of the stories. I struggle to sort of keep interested in it. I can see the appeal across for other people, but for me, and I think some of that is because I grew up very much with the love of fantasy. If I was to try and sort of type shows or movies I would watch as a kid, it was magic. It was myths, it was old school Disney stuff, and it was sort of, so then old school musicals with singing as well. And I think, because Doctor Who is so versatile, you can have a really varying interest of shows and still be a Doctor Who fan, because the TARDIS means one week you can be in a straight historical, and then in the next week you can be in the far future, and then in the next week in the modern one, you can be a very grounded, character-driven story. Even in classic, they did that. So, because of how I feel like when they thought of this concept, maybe they didn't realise what they were doing at the time in the 60s, but they didn't box themselves in any way. It was just, we've got an idea, go for it. And I think Doctor Who embodies that. So, you can love all things and be a Doctor Who fan. That's what I find in my experience anyway. It might be different for you guys.
What did you make of the competitive sort of angle there always was between Doctor Who and Star Trek fans and Star Wars fans? We tended to be the ones that were the butt of the jokes, because whilst the budgets on the other two properties were sort of soaring, Doctor Who's was starting to look more threadbare as time went on. They would poke fun at us, wouldn't they? Because they got all those cool action figures that you've been collecting as well.
Did you get a sense of that, Dan, between rivalry between Doctor Who fans and Star Trek?
Oh God, yeah.
Did you? I don't. I don't think I ever got a sense of that. I tell you what, when you were saying that, Dan, what I was thinking of is that there was a publication called Doctor Who Bulletin, notoriously known as DWB. And when that first came out, I was kind of 13 and 14, and I was reading that publication, and there was lots of stuff in there about reminding everybody how good old Doctor Who was and how not so good new Doctor Who was. And I think as kind of an impressionable early Doctor Who fan, in the sense of in growing in my fandom, I think I was influenced by Doctor Who Bulletin, because there were very, older statesmen Doctor Who fans that were writing in that magazine and telling me what was good and what's not so good now. And I think I believed a lot of that. So if that comparison existed between Star Trek and Doctor Who fans at that time, I think naturally I felt that Doctor Who was not as good as it could have been because of what I was reading. So if Star Trek fans were, they had films and it was looking great and the series was looking brilliant, there were some elements, weren't there, of current Doctor Who that was making me realize that it maybe perhaps wasn't as good as it could have been. So I think we were kind of slightly wrong-footed in the 80s because, as you say, the budgets were lessened. It didn't look as glossy as it used to or as scary as it used to. So I think there, although I never got a sense of that rivalry between Star Trek and Doctor Who fans, there definitely was a one-upmanship because Doctor Who was perceived not to be as good as it used to be in all kinds of different publications, I think.
No, you're right. We had a received fan wisdom problem, I think. And in the days where most of Doctor Who was inaccessible, some of which because they'd wiped it, but most of it was simply locked up in the archives. There was no way any of us could get to it. So the more of it that the people who we would meet along the way had seen, then it established as almost hierarchy within Doctor Who fandom in itself, which I think that took a long time to dissipate. I think it probably actually didn't disappear completely until about 10 years ago, come to think of it. And I don't think there's any real malice in that as such. It was just a product of its time, as a lot of things are. And that kind of idea that, it's just not as good as it used to be. That's something that you see repeated across culture sort of everywhere, whatever we're talking about. I suppose that the best days, the best stories are always 10 or 15 years ago. There's been hundreds of Doctor Who stories screened now, of course, of various lengths in the 20th and the 21st century, whether they're cut up into 25-minute chunks, 45-minute slices, or longer. There are whole season-long arcs now, too. Again, this is another of the most frequently asked questions of all, Anthony. Do you have a favourite Doctor Who story?
Oh my goodness. I think about guilty pleasures and Doctor Who not being as good as it used to be. And you're absolutely right, Dan, about, the revival of 80s Doctor Who. Now everybody loves it, or most people love it, when most people in the 80s hated it. And, if you think about guilty pleasures, one of my favorite stories is Paradise Towers. For all kinds of reasons. But when that went out, it was absolutely hated with every breath. And I remember as a 16-year-old quite enjoying it and thinking, this is great. And then going into DWB and then being told it was not so good and me believing it wasn't so good. But now everybody's watched that. And I think the Happiness Patrol as well, because of the revival on Blu-ray, and said, aren't those stories great? Aren't they fun? And you kind of feel as though you've kind of come full circle. But my all-time favorite, so that's probably Paradise Towers is my guilty pleasure. I love the Leisure Hive for all of its music and its difference, and it's kind of all Doctor Who's back, and it doesn't look as as fun and as jokey as the Tom Baker's had looked up until that point. But now here's the Leisure Hive, and it's kind of deadly serious, and Tom Baker's looking like the same Tom Baker Doctor as the first 3 years. So that was also exciting. But I think my all-time favourite Doctor Who story is a story called The Deadly Assassin, where the Doctor has no companion, but we go back to Gallifrey, and I've always loved Deadly Assassin. It was a bloody nightmare of an audio to record as a child because you've got Tom Baker's fantastic monologue, And then you got nothing. There was lots of beeps and whistles and kind of Gallifreyan alarms and Tom running into lifts and coming out of lifts and shutting doors and opening doors. And the audio doesn't stand up. It was like, what's going on with this particular story?
Yeah.
But it is my all-time favorite story, as I saw go out. So I'm kind of commenting down on anything from Robot to the end of Survivor.
Those are some distance apart, aren't they? The Deadly Assassin and Paradise Towers. Paradise Towers is one of a set of stories, I suppose, that got tagged, labelled as oddball. Do you remember that term, oddball? I mean, do you tend to, have you got a type of story you go for? The spooky ones, the spacey ones, or the oddball ones? Or can it be just anything that quite eclectically can just strike the right note with you?
It was interesting because what I was going to add, Dan, is that when I started seeing the tapes come over from Australia, I was going back into old Doctor Who. And then there were some other standout ones that I'd never seen. And there were two from John Pertwee's time, which was Inferno and The Mind of Evil, both written by Don Houghton, which I thought were incredible Doctor Who stories. And I thought, oh my gosh, they were really good in the past as well. And then to go further back, I think you've reviewed it on Type 40, was The Time Meddler, which I hadn't seen go out. That took a long while for me to see on video because those weren't being shown in Australia. So those had to come by other means to be able to rewatch those. So I think some of the collections of Ian Levine, when they had been secured from the BBC, were finding its way out to other fans via VHS. So it took a long time for me to see some black and white ones. But I do remember a very pristine copy of The Invasion, which I absolutely loved, because here was a kind of Patrick Troughton that wasn't the Crotons, which we'd seen in Five Faces. And it was brilliant. So I kind of working backwards, Dan, from kind of Paradise Towers right into some very vintage black and white Doctor Who, which was the last of the old Doctor Who that I took to see.
Every story is someone's favourite, Charlotte. I mean, again, this is another mantra that I always try to observe when there's a story that I always think is like the worst of the worst. Usually that does mean I'm within 2 or 3 weeks of speaking to a Doctor Who fan who absolutely loves it.
Well, here's the thing, like, every story's got so many working parts that some of those parts will hit with people and other parts they'll either not bother with or they can't stand. It's like Anthony was talking about guilty pleasures. Mine is The Beast Below from Matt's first series, because what I love about The Beast Below is it's the character work. It's the fact that it's a companion's first adventure with a doctor again, and I always find them very interesting. And especially with Amy, you've got such a fiery, you've got such a loud at times, you've got such sort of this ball of sort of energy and everything about her. And you see her sort of get used to the Doctor and her observations of the Doctor. But I've spoke to people who think that episode is absolutely terrible. And that's what's lovely. Like, we can have these different experiences. We can watch the same material, but it will hit us and it might not. And I think every story does need to have some look and see how you react to it. Do you find that, Sarah?
Yeah, I do. I don't think there's any of like the modern era that I don't. Well, even something like Fear Her has got. I like the idea. There was a really good idea in there. It just wasn't executed very well. I think that's what tends to happen. Usually, is there's a good idea in there. There's a good character, but whether that's filming or budgetary reasons, it falls apart. But I've got to say, I found Paradise Towers a very difficult watch, Anthony. I've got to admit. I've got it as a completist, but again, I think the idea's brilliant. But I just want to shake Mel. Like, how do you not know that you're in danger, Mel? Like, get out, you stupid woman.
Listening to Anthony talk about that experience, Sarah, of watching Paradise Towers and loving it on whatever level, and then going to his peers at the time, which in those days was a letters column of a magazine that would come out every 4 or 5 weeks, and there you'd get some sort of barometer take the pulse of the rest of fandom. And okay, you get that sometimes in the school playground, but it would depend on which part of your phase of your life you were in at any given time. I remember getting sort of really quite hurt and what we would now call triggered, when I'd really enjoyed something and then I'd go into school and people would be pointing and laughing as if I'd made it myself, or sometimes when I first joined the Doctor Who sort of local groups, and I'd had similar experiences to Anthony. There'd been a story or two that I'd really liked. I'd mentioned the fact that I liked it to whatever, and the look that I got, if looks could kill, from one other fan in particular, my God, I'd have gone down like I've been struck by a weeping angel. Now, all these decades on, we can share literally right away. I mean, some people don't even wait until the episode's been on for 10 minutes before they're hitting social media telling you what they think of every single scene, Anthony. So it's really, really different. But I think it's a process we've all got to go through. And maybe the technology is different and the way we connect is different. But the experience is probably the same. It's just sort of all mixed up and much more heightened now.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm rounding on DWB a bit, and there are other publications that were managing to tell the same story about.
Their letters column, though, was far more interesting than any other, because the editor, Gary Lee, devoted so many pages to it, but also it wasn't as, I don't want to use the word censored, it didn't feel as heavily screened.
Yes, agreed. And then you would then go with so you'd watch Paradise Towers for argument's sake, then you'd go into the letters page of DWB, and that would create the narrative around that particular story. Then you'd think, I feel a bit stupid for liking that story because that's what my older statesman fans were saying they liked about that particular story. So that was quite influential. And then you'd think, is there anything that would confirm or deny that the DW's approach, that the black and white Doctor Who's were better? And then they would find something like Evil of the Daleks episode 2 and then show it at Panopticon in 1987. And you sit and watch it on the big screen for the very first time. And you think, bloody hell, that's good. That's really, really good. And then it kind of adds into the narrative that they were absolutely right and this was absolutely wrong. So it was self-perpetuating itself, wasn't it? That then a new old Doctor Who would come back again and we would watch it. And it would just remind us again that the old black and white ones were brilliant and the new colour ones were not as good. And it would just keep rolling on. And I think John Nathan Turner got the blunt of lots of, obviously as the producer, but of that criticism that now in hindsight was unfounded. I was always a good friend of John's, but a big supporter of John Nathan Turner, and then we were being told not to be, and then it was quite a confusing time for a young Doctor Who fan. But nowadays you just go on X and social media, and everybody's out there with that information, and you haven't got time to have an opinion. I don't think everybody else is giving you theirs first. So,
Anthony, I suppose another rite of passage as we close in on the final frequently asked questions is this: have you ever been so dissatisfied, so incensed, or disappointed or disenfranchised that you have yourself complained to the BBC, either by letter or by phone call, made a polite, constructive suggestion maybe to the powers that be, or let it fly and given any of them a really hard time?
Yes. To my share.
Okay.
Again, I think I know Gary Lee from DWB, and as an adult, as grown up as older people, and we get on really well, and we've chatted a lot about DWB more recently, but DWB was a very big part of my fandom life. So, the Doctor Who news section of DWB would outstrip the news section of the Doctor Who magazine, because that was printed weeks and months in advance, and DWB could be printed out in a day and you'd get the news the next day. So you'd wait for the post to find out what the next new bit of Doctor Who news would be. So DWB, along with others of those kind of grandiose Doctor Who fans, Jeremy Bentham, Ian Levine, organised a day of action where various fans would, do petitions, appear on television programs. It was that the time when Ian smashed a television screen with a hammer, all of that, or maybe that was the 80s and when Trial of a Time Lord came along. Anyway, he was very proactive. There was a Doctor Who raffle where you could win some of Ian's original props. I mean, it was to bring Doctor Who back, it was a national day of action. And I remember being energized with the Doctor Who fan clubs across the United Kingdom, and then phoning local BBC station to come and watch Doctor Who fans petition people in the centre of Bath, of which we had a couple of scarves and a small model TARDIS. And that was probably the highlight or low light, depending on your point of view, of my Doctor Who kind of activism, if you like, to bring back Doctor Who. Could you imagine that happening now? Could you imagine that, Sarah?
I was just wondering, do you own a copy of Doctor in Distress? Did you buy it, Anthony?
I did buy
it. How many copies did you buy?
One.
Just the one.
That's all you could cope with.
That's all you can manage, right? But
if you're listening, I've got two, Ian. I've got the 7-inch and the 12-inch. Does that make me a bigger fan?
He hates that album. Just saying, he won't talk about it.
I know he does.
But that was my activism, that day of action, where you were ignited. And I think the BBC Points West was a bit disappointed when there was like 6 of us in a scarf and 100 signatures on a clipboard. I'd love to see that news feature again. If anybody's got it, I'd love to re-see that, because I don't own that. I don't have that. So I'd love to see that again. But yeah, that's kind of when I've been kind of motivated to petition for
the full Doctor Who fan sort of experience, isn't it? I don't think you've really had a full rites of passage unless you've done something like that, proved our devotion, I suppose, to the cause in one way or another.
I wrote a letter of complaint.
Did you?
I did during the Jodie Whittaker era.
Did you really? Who did you write to?
I for the BBC Complaints Department. It was the Can You Hear Me episode. You remember with Bradley Walsh?
Yeah.
And I was so incensed. I thought it was so insensitive. And I was very angry that, as a family show, that was the role model for children watching. And the Doctor was so callous. And at that point, I was like, no, I'm going to actually have to put something into words and work through this. And it was a lot more therapeutic than just ranting on social media. And I just got a fobbed off reply. But I felt better for just doing it, And I was very polite, there was did it all properly. But yes, it was quite...
You didn't cut the letters out of a newspaper, did you, and glue them down?
No.
Science in tomato sauce.
No, I didn't go that far. Oh dear. I always think, what do people receive though? I always think of poor Peter Capaldi being such a menace.
Well, it's be so weird for you, Anthony, that like when you were growing up, you said in the first run that a lot of these actors and producers, you didn't have the access. You didn't have like their public Twitter profiles. You didn't have this sort of them being so on as much as sort of being as much of their own personality as whether they're playing or writing, for example. And for you to sort of go from that for years to now what the modern show, for good and for bad, I think there's been some good things that's come from that, like the watch-alongs, and when the writers have been sort of talked on with fans, it's been some lovely experiences. But for all the lovely ones, you've sort of seen a different side that you never did before. Like, how do you feel about that shift in fandom?
Yeah, that's a good question, Charlotte, because I think sometimes it's very different, but sometimes very similar. And there was this, you talk about Sarah writing to the BBC. You would ritually write to the BBC for a Doctor Who fact sheet newsletter. As long as you put a stamped address envelope, you'd have it come back. And John's secretary would be frantically typing up a new newsletter every couple of weeks to say which story is in production, what the working title might be. That information, to acquire that information, took Charlotte effort to get that information. It took, it took power to be able to do that. And if you wanted to write to a Doctor Who actor, you would, again, the newsletter would keep updating, and various actors' agents' addresses would be featured on the back of the newsletter. So definitely the new cast was care of BBC Television Centre, but there were some older casts that you could start to communicate with, like Ian Marter, for example, and Tom Baker was on that list. But there were some people from the past that really wasn't on that list. And it took a long time to be able to acquire their autograph or to see them in person, because now everybody is where everybody can get them, in that sense of the Blu-ray collection. Everybody's been seen from the old series. They've been found and located. But I was going to conventions so Jeremy Bentham would host a convention, and he would, with pure delight, with absolute delight, say, I remember I was at a convention in Manchester called Monopticon, and it was with absolute delight. He said, we have a guest here that's turned up. The net has become slightly smaller all of a sudden, that we found somebody from the 60s, and that person was Jackie Lane, and we'd never seen her in person before. She hadn't signed anything, she hadn't talked about it. I mean, she was a bit reluctant, and continued to be reluctant, but the net got a little bit smaller each time that those, particularly from those like Maureen O'Brien, like Annika Wills wasn't even in the country. She would come to her first ever convention and say, I didn't know this was a thing, this fandom. This was happening away from me, and now suddenly you found me. And people would try and locate these companions from the past and find them. Michael Craze was running a pub. They were in different situations where you wouldn't expect to find them. So yes, Charlotte, that's a good question, because I think now everybody's where you can get them. We all know where they all are. But in the 80s, it was more exciting that you were finding people for the first time, and they were coming back and talking about Doctor Who.
Shrouded in mystery.
I have such respect for JNT for going on what was the show called? It wasn't Points of View, but it was like
Open Air.
To sit and listen to that criticism. And I think a lot of the TV people today might want to learn a thing or two. I would dearly love to have RTD Chibnall and Moffat. He doesn't escape from this.
No, you're right.
And
you're right.
I think that might not necessarily solve a lot of problems, but I think it would go somewhere to maybe heal some of the divisions that have turned up in fandom over the past few years.
Because Sarah, even though it was unusual for a showrunner, writer, producer, whatever you want to call it, to have any kind of public profile at all, broadly speaking, John Nathan Turner wasn't alone. Producers and directors of things like Casualty would go on Open Air too. It was, and Right of Reply on Channel 4. It was a thing. It was part of the culture. And they were, I mean, I'm not sure any of them kind of got it in the neck the way that J&T did a time or two. It wasn't a consistent thing. But there was almost this belief that it was if not an obligation, that it was probably the right thing to do to speak to your punters. The customer is always right. Listen to what they've got to say and take it on the chin and be adult about it, which seems to have escaped us now.
Yeah, I think there was a real air of respect back then for the viewer, that they are, at the end of the day, they're the ones that are making your program keep being on air. You wouldn't keep getting renewed or be a show that now stands at 60 plus years if you didn't have people from kids' ages to adults to everybody watching your show. And that's what I always find when I see old footage of J&T or the old actors. The way they speak, you can tell there's that understanding of, it's like this relationship almost, that you have to have respect. Both ends, from the fans, have to also give respect, but they also have to give it as well.
As if they were setting an example of sorts, I think Anthony. Finally, I want to ask, after all these years, all this involvement, seeing so much, not just on the screen, but behind the screen, and striking up so many friendships with people through the show and from the show. Does Doctor Who still inspire you?
Oh, that's a good question. Gosh, that's a really good question. I have to split it between old and new. So classic Doctor Who still continues to inspire me. You know, if I'm having a low moment in my life, I bung on, you know, the Sunmakers, Spearhead from Space, any of those stories from, we'll begin with S, any of those stories from the past.
Yeah.
They excite me, they lift my spirits, they inspire me, all of those words for that. You know, I could watch old Doctor Who ad infinitum. Does new Doctor Who inspire me? It used to, around Eccleston's time and early Tennant, but I've lost my Doctor Who mojo around new Doctor Who. I don't know why that is. I kind of, you know, when we were doing the live shows around the second series for Ncuti Gatwa, I was a little bit more inspired than I previously had been, but I've kind of lost it for new Doctor Who. Now I don't run at it in the same way as I used to. But if you tell me that Series 13 is coming out on Blu-ray in a week's time, I'm there. So that really inspires me and still continues to interest me in a way that the new series does not.
So the magic still works to some degree or another. Antony Wainer, you have been an inspirational and excellent subject that could be enough for the time being to keep them off your back. Who knows? You may want to make your escape while you can. Give the TARDIS the once-over whilst we distract them with a short interlude from Airtime Lords at the Fandom Podcast Network, led by our Kev, who's stopping time to give you everything you could ever need to know about everything going on those other shows across the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network. Check it out.
Thank you for listening. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. Here are the other great shows on the Fandom Podcast Network. Culture Clash, where we discuss the latest in entertainment and pop culture. Blooded Kings, our show covering the entire Highlander universe. Couch Potato Theater, we celebrate our favorite movies. And Time Warp, our fandom flashback show discussing a year in movies and our favorite retro movie, TV, and pop culture topics. Good Evening, discussing all things Alfred Hitchcock. Hair Metal Podcast, we cover the rock metal music of the 80s and early 90s. Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast, discussing the time-traveling Doctor Who universe. Lethal Mullet, an action film podcast covering the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Also, check out the Lethal Mullet Network for more great podcasts. What a Piece of Junk, our Star Wars podcast. Making Treks, a Star Trek podcast with a deep dive into the final frontier. The Fandom Show, our Fandom Podcast Network live YouTube show discussing the hottest topics in fandom. The True Believers MCU podcast discussing the Marvel Cinematic and Television Universe. Union Federation, our Star Trek and the Orville show. And we're proud to welcome the BQN Network to the Fandom Podcast Network. Please visit our friends on the BQN Network, a Star Trek Universe podcast that also includes your favorite topics, movies, history, superheroes, and more. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on YouTube. The Fandom Podcast Network is also on all major podcast platforms. The Fandom Podcast Network audio master feed is on Podbean at fpnet.podbean.com. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can email us at fandompodcastnetwork@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, respect others and enjoy your fandom.
And you can treat yourself or treat your other selves to a little something from a selection of merchandise over at the Fandom Podcast Network's TeePublic Store. There's a link to all of that in the show notes. It all goes right back into supporting the network in its continuing mission to keep you topped up with the very best in geeky pop culture coverage, so everybody wins. One last question, I think, Antony. Where do you want us to drop you off? The past, the present, or the future?
Well, if you're talking about Doctor Who, the television series, it's definitely the past. Where would you like me to be dropped off in terms of the narrative? Oh gosh, that's a hard one. Definitely something historical, I think. So definitely go back into the past also. It'd be quite interested to visit some events in history. Which ones, I don't know, but it's always quite alluring to go back. I'm not sure I want to see the future right now, so maybe I'm quite contented just to go back.
There's the gurgling and the rumbling, calling time on another conversation. But there's more on the way soon enough. Look out for that, wherever it was you found this. Maybe our dedicated home feed, that's type40.podbean.com. We're across all major podcatchers, Spotify, Audible, Amazon Music, Apple, all those places and lots more. See us as well as hear us on our YouTube and Rumble channels with enhanced video editions of every show. And there's exclusive extra videos and live streams too. Not forgetting our mothership, the Fandom Podcast Network's master feed. Please consider a trip sideways in time there for more quality, practically daily shows from the FPN. Make contact through our social medias. Have your say on all of this and that. Instagram and X at Type40 Doctor Who. Email us, type40doctorwho@outlook.com. And there's still the Type40 Facebook group too. Of course there is thousands of other Doctor Who fans from all over the world, maybe a few other worlds too. Rants and raves, discussions and debates, issues of the moment or the ongoing storms. It's all on the wall there at the Type40 Facebook group. Get stuck in with fellow fans and companions. And everything's still in one piece, sort of. What a privilege to get to know Antony Wainer that little bit better there, Charlotte. Even after all these months, you don't really get to know a Doctor Who fan until you dig in deep with the frequently asked questions, I don't feel.
Yeah, especially as right now we're at a quiet time, but we've had a pretty heavy, sort of hectic year with Doctor Who. We've had a lot of noise, a lot of things going on, so it was lovely just to sort of have a proper sort of conversation again with friends. That's what this felt like, so that's what I loved about tonight.
Happy times and places, Sarah. Sharing is caring.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's nice to just be able to take a breath. This is the best part, let's be honest. It's talking to friends and just geeking out about Doctor Who. And I could listen to Antony's stories all day. It's just like Simon. I just love hearing. And I've got to admit, a little bit envious with, being a child of the 70s. But, unless I've got a time machine, that's never going to happen for me. So if I've got to hear it secondhand, I'd like it to be from Antony, so that's lovely. And it feels like we've been on Through the Keyhole. Maybe we should bring that back, Type40 Through the Keyhole.
Maybe. Who'd be game for that? I'd have to put the Hoover around. I'd probably get a maid in first, come to think of it, in my case. But Antony, thank you for letting us have a route around in the big grey hard drive there and unlock some great memories, compare and contrast, which I think is really what the spirit of what Doctor Who fandom truly is. And a few shocking revelations too.
Oh yeah, agreed. And it was lovely to share some of those memories with you all, and everybody's watching this evening. It's been great to do, and there are still many more stories bubbling away in here. So there were many more opportunities where I could take you down some alleyways and tell you some more stories, but maybe I'll keep those for another time. But you're absolutely right. Being a Doctor Who fan in the 70s and particularly the 80s, and the people that I met was really fortunate.
Okay, so the Time Lords have reinstalled you in the correct time and space continuum, Antony, at least for now. We'll see you back on the podcast sooner rather than later. I know we've got lots of plans, but thanks again for everything that you've shared on this edition of the show. Had a lot of fun with those frequently asked questions. Who knows who could be next? But that does wrap it up for this one. We always have the time if you have the space here at Type40, a Doctor Who podcast. See you next time. Bye-bye.